I'm Inwood Lane and I'm speaking. In my previous installment, I spoke from um, Project 25, 2025, giving you actual chapter and verse of some of the very things that these people have been implementing in recent weeks with the current administration through the Orange Felon Liar. I've also tried to give you context of what's going on in that. I'll put it like this. At one time, I said back in 2016 that there was a concerted effort to make this country white again. And it's glaringly obvious that that's what that what the effort is now is to make this country white again, to make white supremacy the rule and law of the land and the way of society. Can they accomplish that? Can it be accomplished? Well, I'll put it like this. I mentioned in the onset of my previous installment that there's a massacre that is happening, that is occurring. And the massacre is not with bullets and blood, it's between the ears. The massacre is between the ears, in which the uninformed and the apathetic are being exploited. They've been used as useful idiots to accomplish an agenda that, if successful, can dominate society for the next 50 years. It would be like, in historical terms, when Plessy versus Ferguson pretty much ended whatever social gains that were made post slavery, post Civil War, post establishment of the 14th Amendment. Plessy versus Ferguson was basically the law of the land. Outside of women earning the right to vote, it was the law of the land for the next 55 years, the next two going on three generations. And then it was another 20 years before it was pretty much shelved, if you will, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But since Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and even more so since the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65, respectively, there's been a long game being played by white supremacists at their core to reverse those gains that have been made. Now, I would be naive to think that in the talk of a more perfect union that there will be this day of equality. I don't know, because at the very core of this country is it's a racist core. It's a colonizing core. It is a white supremacist core. And but what I want to do is this entire um complete this entire discourse with the other notes that I had compiled when reading the first 25 to 50 pages of that Project 2025 propaganda. Now, to continue with the notes that I took, these words came to me. First word was Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy came about right after the Civil Rights Act, in which you had the Dixiecrats and the segregationists who were up in arms about uh, voting rights for blacks and really the reality of integration, the reality of blacks having the right to public places, to be able the right to walk on the same side of the street as a white person. And so you had people who try to appeal to those voters, to that electorate, with dog whistles and foghorns and what have you, certain things that were said to let them know that, hey, we're thinking about you, we got you, just stick with us, hang with us. Okay. And then there was this lull. There's a little bit of a lull, but then it kind of there was a resurgence in a different brand through the moral majority, which was led by Jerry Falwell. at the beginning of, also in that era was the beginning or the founding of the Heritage Foundation, which is the people that is behind Project 2025. And so, um, the Moral Majority Christian Coalition, which came afterward, and another thing that came to mind, Liberty University. At the core of these people was a white resistance to integration. Many of these people, at their core, was a white resistance to integration, a white resistance to civil rights. And they figured that they would simply form their own fucking schools and teach what they wanted to teach, all under the guise of family, freedom, and liberty. They can also invoke their teachings of morality for the preservation of the family and values that they believe that this country was founded upon. Now, what I want to do is read from this article that's from the Religion Dispatches. Now, it starts off talking about the crazy or ironic relationship between the Orange Felon Liar and Jerry Falwell Jr., but it goes into talking very briefly about Liberty University's history. Now, this article came out in August 31st, 2020. And you see here, there's a picture of Ronald Reagan with Jerry Falwell. He had the ear of Reagan, as did there were in other subsequent presidencies, folk like the people of Falwell's ilk had the ear of George Bush, George W. Bush, and George H.W. Bush. But that may be in another installment. So the article goes on to say, why, we might ask, did his departure take so long? Why was it the kinky sex that took him down when he risked lives to reopen the university in the midst of a pandemic, offended black alumni with his creation of a black face mask, and made a mockery of Christian ethics with his support for a 3-time married candidate who boasts of sexually predatory behavior? Because of Falwell's worst offenses didn't violate core fundamentalist principles that define Liberty University's understanding of the Bible, that is disbelief of science, racism, and male domination of women, the trifecta on which they bet their future. The first core principle was solidified in 1925 by the Scopes trial when fundamentalist Christians opposed the teaching of evolution, which challenged the bedrock Genesis text holding up white male supremacy. And after the Supreme Court mandated the desegregation of public schools in 1954, white Christians started creating thousands of private religious schools. Fundamentalist Jerry Falwell Sr. founded the whites-only Lynchburg Academy in 1967, which later became Liberty University to avoid desegregation. These are known facts. Now, many of you may argue, what has the Democrat Party done for you lately? Well, what has the Republican Party done for you lately? So then you argue that maybe you need to shift your allegiance or alliance to the Republicans, since Democrats haven't done anything for you lately. You feel that Democrats have ignored you. Now, there may be truth to that argument that the Democrat Party has taken the black vote for granted, and they have ignored you. There's truth that the Democrat Party has also taken the Latino vote for granted. But guess what? All that shit talking leading up to this past presidential election, what has it gotten you? Well, it's gotten you Project 2025 being implemented right before your fucking eyes. And where are you now? Are you still talking about how the Democrats haven't done anything for you lately? Or are you talking about what the Republicans have done for you? Or what they will do for you? Let me give you more insight. I said Project 2025. You don't have to read the entire document to understand what's being done. They sum much of it up in the first 25 to 50 pages. The people who are behind Project 2025 spoke have spoken reverently of Ronald Reagan. He was a symbol of power and resolve. Reagan also served as a two-term governor of California back in a time during the 1960s when that state was known for its independent streak, but also being a Republican bastion. And while he was always seen as Teflon and merely an actor, and maybe even a goof and a buffoon, he was adept at communicating to the populace. He was known as the great communicator. So now there's this person, the orange felon liar. When compared to Reagan, he's unquestionably a bigger buffoon and far less qualified. But he has charisma, the kind of charisma that vaulted Hitler into power. But he also portrays himself as a symbol of power and resolve. And most people seem to like, quote, leaders who have that kind of appeal. Now, in a nutshell, this is what I've seen. This is what I've come to understand. In a nutshell, Project 2025 wants a king. Project 2025 wants a tyrant. Project 2025 wants a dictator. They want centralized power. They claim that Congress is far too powerful. So the way to deal with the way to deal with Congress is to circumvent it, do away with agency or inefficient agencies or agencies that are in the crosshairs of their social agenda, like Department of Education, Environmental Protection Agency, many of the consumer watchdog agencies. So they claim that there is no true doctrine of separation of powers. They believe that there is no true checks and balances. They believe that Congress is far too powerful, and this contributes to the administrative state that exists, or certain facets of it, the deep state. They claim Congress is irrelevant but famous. They accuse Congress of passing laws that delegates decision making to a federal agency in which there is no accountability to the president. Now, if you recall this particular thing, I've had this up for all this time because I wanted to, I've had this queued up for a while. The Supreme Court overruled that the Chevron deference, they overturned the Chevron deference, which had been basically 40 years of precedent, legal precedent, in which Congress relied on federal agency to help sort out things that Congress did not specifically spell out in its legislation. Now, the source that I'm coming from is the article from NRDC. And the headline is the Supreme Court in Chevron deference. What now? For one, the ability of federal agencies like the EPA to set rules and enforce environmental protection now shrinks. Now, the article goes on to say, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo dealt a severe blow to the ability of federal agencies to do their jobs by ending a 40-year-old precedent of Chevron deference. Instead of deferring to the expertise of agencies on how to interpret ambiguous language in laws pertaining to their work, federal judges now have the power to decide what a law means for themselves. As a result, not being accountable to the people, judges will now be able to expand their role in the realm of policy making. Now, in a dissent from Judge Elena Kagan, who was once a Solicitor General of the United States, in one fell swoop, the majority today gives itself exclusive power over every open issue, no matter how expertise-driven or policy-laden, involving the meaning of regulatory law. As if it did not have enough on its plate, the majority turns itself into the country's administrative czar. Well, it may be somewhat of in concert. It may be in concert in which the deference really will be now to the tyrant who's been elected, for all we know. Because if you recall, the Supreme Court also, that same Supreme Court also, that majority ruling, Clarence Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, Samuel Alito, John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, and Neil Gorsuch. They also said that president has broad immunity powers, so long as in the context of them performing official duties. Basically, they've given a green light for someone like this orange felon liar to do as he pleased, to do things with impunity. So, um, that's yet another topic that could be discussed in yet another installment. But they're saying, according to their propaganda, unelected bureaucrats at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, strangles domestic energy production. But hey, these same people, obviously, as it is in current news right now, they seem to be all right with an unelected billionaire making recommendations and proclamations and accessing himself and his crew to all the federal records of us citizens and in agencies, and making recommendations of people being let go of their jobs, telling them that hey, they're what they have to offer doesn't match what they need. They seem to be okay with that. It just tells me that there's a lot of hypocrisy of what they're saying. They claim also that bureaucrats at the Department of Education inject racist, anti-American, ahistorical propaganda into America's classrooms. Their vaunted leader that they held in great reverence, Ronald Reagan, talked of doing away with the Department of Education, which would have fulfilled the desires of Dixiecrats and AIDS segregationists at that time. And again, I'm going to say this. When was there talk about doing away with the Department of Education? It certainly wasn't before 1954, but it's been since. They go on to say that bureaucrats at the Department of Justice force school districts to undermine girls' sports and parental rights to satisfy transgendered extremists. They go on to say that woke bureaucrats at the Pentagon forces troops to attend training seminars about white privileges, about white privilege. And they go on to say that bureaucrats at the State Department infuse U.S. foreign aid programs with woke extremism about intersectionality and abortion. Now, I'm going to bring this up. There was recent news about how the military has been ordered to adhere to directives by the Executive Office and the Secretary of Defense in doing away with, for example, a recent workshop that identified with recruiting highly qualified Black talent, among others. So you do away with diversity, equality, and inclusion. Then who are you recruiting, and what are you recruiting? What's left? White males. Now, their propaganda goes on to say, according to the conservative promise, it lays out how to use many tools, including how to fire supposedly unfireable federal bureaucrats like agency heads, people who, well, mainly in the news, it's been about agency heads being fired, just outright, just randomly. You're gone. How to shutter wasteful, corrupt bureaus and offices, how to muzzle woke propaganda at every level of government, how to restore the American people's constitutional authority over the administrative state, and how to save untold taxpayer dollars in the process. So they convolute this shit to say that they're doing all this for everybody's good. Who's good? It's only for a very narrow slice: oligarchs and white males. So they go on to say, finally, the president can restore public confidence and accountability to our most important government function of all, national defense. And the American people desire a military full of highly skilled servicemen and women who can protect their homeland and our interests overseas. They go on to say that the next conservative president must end the left's social experimentation with the military, restore war fighting at its sole mission, and set defeating the threat of Chinese Communist Party at its highest priority. Again, if memory serves me correct, and there are some sources out there about that, there are certain people of that right-wing mentality that are basically saying the only people who seemingly are qualified to really be in the military are white males. Now, one last thing I'm going to end with, and this is just how they have distorted information. They claim that Woodrow Wilson was a president who instituted woke policies. Remember, they're using this term woke policy and wokeism as another dog whistle, another foghorn at saying social social and legal policies or judicial policies that advance diversity, equality, and inclusion, starting with black people. You got to remember that the term woke was a term used by black folk of being apprised, awake about social justice and judicial justice, legal justice. That's what you got to remember. That's what woke was about. Again, I'm going to read this. I'm going to go back over what woke meant. It was being woke by definition means awareness of social and political issues that affect black people. And the issues are like criminal justice system, social justice, educational, the education equality, economic equality, basically a fair and level field that creates opportunity. So the rhetoric about wokeism is really about suppressing the black voice. And as with so many things, the rights that many groups that are being targeted, um, and the opportunities that are afforded to them come after blacks gaining those rights. Next are women, gays, transgendered, handicapped. You get where I'm going. Veterans. Yeah. Now, I'm going to end with showing you how they've contorted, they've twisted and contorted about Woodrow Wilson being woke and a progressive. A further look at Woodrow Wilson's history was that he was actually a racist. He did much to erode blacks who worked in the federal government even 100 years ago. And he was a sympathizer of Jim Crow. He also was a sympathizer of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was separate but equal. He also discouraged admission of blacks at Princeton. If these people have it their way, what they want to see is a revival of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is of 1898. Plessy versus Ferguson was basically the law of the land until 1954, which was Brown versus Board of Education. And then Plessy versus Ferguson was then shelved when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed. This is what they're looking. This is the long game. I'm telling you. But I want to read some material about Woodrow Wilson, and then I'll end this particular segment of I'm Speaking. All right. Now, the article that I'm reading is from uh, Guo Zhu. He was an associate professor of business and policy at University of California. And this article in October 2020 was about how Woodrow Wilson's racist policies eroded black civil service. And the article goes on to say that black Americans worked before the election of Woodrow Wilson. Black Americans worked at all levels of the federal government. But when Wilson assumed office in 1913, so that's over 100 years ago, he mandated that the federal workforce be segregated by race, leading to the reduction of black civil service workers' income, increasing the significant income gap between black and white workers, and eroding some of the gains black people had made following Reconstruction. And that is a finding of a recent National Bureau of Economic Research paper by Berkeley Oz assistant professor Guo Zhu and assistant law professor Abhay Anasia. Now, they examined what it goes on to say is that they examined how Wilson's far-reaching segregation policy affected black workers relative to white workers during the same era. That is basically what's about to happen with all these executive orders about um, doing away with diversity, equality, and inclusion. The segregation of the federal civil service is a dark chapter in the history of American government that has been relatively understudied. Persistent racial inequality remains a major challenge in this country. And we felt it was important to provide systematic, quantitative evidence on the economic costs of such episodes of state sanctioned discrimination. And that's exactly what's going on right now. Though black voters had historically supported the Republican Party, Wilson, a Democrat, gained the support of many black voters, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Monroe Trotter, due to his campaign promise of equal treatment. His racial segregation order came swiftly and suddenly, taking black Americans by surprise. Wilson imposed segregation in his cabinet departments and appointed Southern Democrats who were likely in favor of segregationist policies to lead them. Researchers point out that unlike the purported separate but equal policies of the Jim Crow era, Wilson's order was overtly discriminatory. Wilson's segregation directive was designed to limit access of black civil servants to white-collar positions via both demotions and failure to hire qualified black candidates. Segregation was first implemented at the post office, which is home to over 60% of federal jobs at the time and employed many black workers, and next at the Treasury Department, which had the second largest number of black workers. Need I say any more? This was a quantitative study by professors at the University of California, Berkeley. So what you're seeing at its very core is a white supremacist agenda. It's already been spelled out in their propaganda, Project 2025. You've heard it in the campaign of this orange felon liar. You've heard it in many of the people who are in his administration. What more else can be said? What more else can be said? But I wanted to take the time to share with you actual stuff from their propaganda so that you can see for yourself, because it's being played out every day of this administration. So with that, that's all I have to share. I'm Inwood Lane, and I'm speaking.